Do you want to increase your ability to draw complex subjects freehand in ink, or in any media for that matter? Then let me demonstrate a great drawing technique for doing it. I've drawn one of the steeples of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and I hope you agree it's a complex subject to draw freehand. I'm using a 0.2mm Copic multi-liner pen to draw it, and it took me 60 minutes to draw in real time. So let me explain to you, as you watch a sped up version of the drawing, what I'm observing, what I'm thinking, what I'm drawing, the order in which I'm doing it, and the quite deliberate and constant techniques I use to do it. Let's start. The starting point is always going to be the most difficult point. What I like to do is to establish my first reference point. So I choose a subject, a part of the subject that I can draw in proportion. And in this drawing, it's the one column that I start with. And whatever it is, it's very important because in this first object I draw, I'm really starting to establish the proportion and the scale of my drawing. The proportion, I want the ratio of height to width to be correct. And for scale, well, whether I draw this one column larger or smaller or the same size as my reference will determine whether my finished drawing, if it all goes to plan, will be larger or smaller or the same size as my reference. So these first marks need to be very considered as we put them on the paper. But after we've carefully done the very first object, that first column, now I have to just as carefully establish a section, a reference section, which will end up being very important for alignment and for measuring other distances. I've got the column. I do the column to the left in this case, and that gives me a parallelogram approximately. And now I use the width of that as I now move to the right in this curved front section. Now I'm looking carefully to see where this column's going to be, and I need to make sure that I align the height at the top of it properly, because it's not at the same height as the two columns I've already drawn. And in fact, when I get to the columns on the extreme right-hand side, the two that similarly face out to the two that I started with, they're actually slightly lower than the ones that I first draw. So I have to spot all of these things in my careful observation. Observation is always important, but it's even more critical at the start when we haven't yet quite got our head around how the perspective's working, perhaps as fully as we will by the time we've drawn more of this. So I'm now working outwards on each side to establish this entire section going across the steeple. And this is going to be now the section that I use to reference up and down. When I need to work out how far across to take any line or starting or finishing point for anything at all, I will measure it off this section, this width section. I will measure it first off the reference, and then I will find that same point on my drawing. So now I'm going upwards, and it's really important when I do these vertical lines, not so much these small ones, but when I do the vertical lines that I'm about to do in a moment, it's important to align them with what's underneath according to the reference. Because particularly in a shape such as this spire, where there are stacked sections that in effect step back from each other, then unless we're looking at it straight on, things don't necessarily align as easily as we would like. And particularly where we have shapes changing as they stack, or where the alignment changes as they stack higher. And so I'm having to work out this height, and I actually work it out primarily from the arch. I look at the shadowed area of the arch and I seek to proportion it so it looks the same in my drawing with what I've already drawn as it is in the reference. And then I do the pseudo entablature banding above it. And that works quite well, I think. I'm happy with these proportions so far. And of course, there's also careful paying attention as to how the details work from this perspective. So we have these curved buttresses coming out that are very decorative and very characteristic of the steeples of St. Paul's. And we need to just make sure we observe how the curve looks from this viewing point, from this perspective. And then we have another section which sits on top with small squarish windows. And again, we want to make sure the proportions of our windows are the same as the proportions on the reference. And that will help assure us that we've got the overall drawing progressing with some measure of accuracy. And now I've got this little capped roof on top. I draw it in two sections wherever possible. I draw these sorts of little domed roofed towers, especially where they go from convex to concave in stages. I'm a little heavy-handed on the right-hand side, which is always the challenging side of a curve for me, being right-handed myself, and particularly so because I'm also bumping several lights with my filming setup as I do it as well. So now I've really got the top half of the drawing done, and in some ways I'm thinking probably the more straightforward half done. And now I have to start to sort out how I'm going to progress downwards from that and work out exactly what I'm going to do. Now you see me measuring the perspective angle with my pen. I do this not just when I'm drawing from references, but I do this when I'm drawing on location as well. We can hold up the pen in front of our eyes and align it to the angle of whatever our subject is and then bring it straight down to our paper. It's surprisingly accurate. It doesn't sound like it would be, but it is. Now I'm working on the clock, which was always going to be the challenge. And the perspective angle of the little horizontal bits on each side of the curve of the cornice that sits above the clock, that perspective angle is not really correct. It flattens out too much. The right-hand side should be lower than I've drawn it. And this does end up causing me some grief. It's not much to look at now, but it sets in motion a train of decisions and choices that end up being, in my mind, the one thing that is least accurate in this drawing. But for now, I haven't really noticed it. But later as well, you will see that I'm actually able to give the appearance of dropping that perspective angle somewhat, but it was a bit too late to rescue some further consequences of it. But at this point, I'm drawing these decorative elements that sit on the corners, and this is where the alignment changes from the, if you like, the diagonal to the square with the base. So I look at this and it's hard not to think, oh, I wish I could have this moment again and just spend another moment. But I honestly did actually check that angle about 2 or 3 times. So just wasn't going to be able to see it as accurately as I needed to at this point. And so this circle is in fact an ellipse. And so that's another challenge drawing freehand, and where we can't make any guidelines. We can't draw parallelograms or skewed boxes or squares and divide it into 4 with a pencil, which we can then erase. We have to work out our lines in a way that we can live with every line that's on the paper. And exactly what that means really does depend on what detail we have to, in effect, cover over any marks that we make. And with this clock, there is scope to, if you like, massage the fullness of the curve to make it a bit greater than perhaps I first draw it, because I can push the dark areas out more, either in the actual clock face colouring or in the ornate banding around it. And you see, I'm trying to create the distinctions still between the darker centre part of the clock and the lighter value around the numbers. And so, yeah, I'm sort of pushing that corner down a bit by shifting some of the teeth. And then I've next got these figures to place, these rather large sculptural groups, which are possibly a little more challenging than the more geometric decorations we have higher up, the more urn-shaped items that we've drawn already. So the first thing now again is to align where these statues are. I want to align where their heads are in relation to what I've already drawn. And then I want to make sure I position it, aligning it with vertical and horizontal reference points. And so the head of this seated figure sits away from what I've drawn before, about halfway up from, if you like, the base to the overhanging corners above. And then I have a similar positioning to do with what I've already drawn with the other one. Now, these heads of these figures should align on the perspective angle as well, because they align horizontally when we look straight on. So the one on the left should appear slightly higher than the one on the right, just to allow for that. And also doing this positioning of this cornice and the decorative brackets with the overhang. Now, it was this line that I've just done, this cornice that I've just done, and particularly the lines beneath it, that I really haven't got correct. I was thinking, well, because I've flattened out the perspective angle at the clock level, I should flatten these angles out more than in the reference. And so I did, but I've really flattened them too much, particularly with the bottom lines. They just sit a little too horizontally, I think, for what's happening above them. But it's always good to have a focus for the next drawing that we do. And now we're in the home stretch of this, and we've got the space, the rounded space to the left, which clearly isn't going to have a clock in it. But I think if this tower had had bells put in it, then this space would have helped the bells to ring out more. And I think looking at this, I let that left-hand circular section maybe just come a tiny bit out too far. Oh, maybe not, actually. No, I'll take that back. I think it's happy enough where it sits. And then we have another statue that we have to draw as well, which is in fact the largest sculpture that we have in this scene to draw. I've got some videos on drawing architectural sculptures. It's different to drawing figures. It's not figure drawing. The scale makes it a bit challenging, and the fact that these aren't a main subject, that they're a decorative element amongst many decorative elements, and we want them to sit in place. We don't want them to look awkward or complicated. And we want them to fit the otherwise architectural decorations as well. So I think there are some special techniques we can use in thinking about how we draw them and then how we actually draw them. And I do have a couple of videos on drawing architectural sculptures if they're a problem for you. If you avoid buildings that you'd like to draw because you look at what's in the pediments and think, oh, I couldn't possibly draw all that, I'll have to give it a miss, then those videos might just be the ones that help you. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this helpful. I hope that you have a go at drawing this if you're wanting to try the challenge of a more complex structure, particularly drawing freehand in ink. It may not be as hard as you think if you go about it the right way. And of course, this reference photo will be on my channel community page. But look, Whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. And I'll see you next time. Bye.